doesn't make it.
Are you on? Ooh.
I couldn't do anything while Bill. I had to go onto it in order to get the video of Bill and Warren.
Is there going to be anything more, do you think, like that?
There is a video, but I have to stop and start the last questions.
Okay.
That's what that one is.
So we do need the sound screen. All right.
Yeah, everything should be working.
You'll let me know.
Yeah. If we panic, I will. Welcome back, everybody. We're more or less a little bit late, but only very slightly. We're more or less on schedule. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the University of Adelaide and to this conference our next two speakers. From Deakin University, they're both academics at Deakin University, Tyson Yunkaporta and Kelly Menzel. Now, I'm not going to read through their biographies, which are in the programme. You can read them yourself. I am going to tell you that the best book I read last year, not comparing, not textbook or anything, the best book I read last year, the one that made me think the most, was a book called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. And one of the reviewers on the front cover, here, somebody called Melissa Lukashenko, has referred to it as an extraordinary invitation into the world of the dreaming. It's one of those books you're not going to read just once. And I'm not going to do a review of it now or anything. I strongly recommend you get a copy of this book, get hold of it through your library, or maybe buy a copy like I did. It's written by Tyson. And there is a major contribution to the book. And lots of words from Kelly. I wanted to read some words that Tyson quoted from Kelly in the book, just a couple of sentences. The boundaries of public discussion need to be widened with information, compassion, and honesty. Collectively, we need to break free from the bondage of patriarchy, white privilege, and the misogynistic structures that control us. This isn't just desirable, it's necessary if we want to be sustainable. Tyson and Kelly are going to have a chat together, and they're going to welcome us into that chat, and I'd like you to welcome them for me now, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to just a quick acknowledgement of the country that we're on today, that we're meeting on today, and thank their elders, past, present and emerging, for letting us meet today, and also any other Aboriginal people who are here in the room, as well as non-Aboriginal people who are here in the room. So thank you for coming. I'm Kelly Menzel. I'm a Ngadjuri woman, so I actually am an Adelaide girl. Grew up in the Adelaide Hills, but my great-grandmother is from out in the wine region, Clare Valley, so that's where my mob are from. So the red wine is thanks to her. So that's where my family's from, but I actually grew up in the Adelaide Hills here. So yeah, and it's nice to be back in Adelaide. I don't get to come back as often as I would like. So thank you very much for having us. You ready, friend?
Oh, I showed you. I just showed her how to turn that on like 10 times, and now I can't do it. Yeah. You see, I'm better at mansplaining than actually doing it.
He was very helpful.
Yeah. So I guess from my perspective, what we might be doing here is a bit more on the micro side, but I don't know. I feel like it's sort of more macro. We might call it black row. which will be a combination of the two, because really there are no externalities in economies, and so therefore there's no externalities in economics. You really got to look at the big picture, the holistic picture, and so that's where Indigenous thinking is helpful. So my name's Tyson Yunkaporta. I belong to the Upledge clan from Western Cape York. I also have some connections down here and several other places in Australia. Really good to be here. Great to be invited here. The chapter that Kelly and I co-wrote together in Sand Talk is it's called Duck Hunting's Everybody's Business, and so we're going to touch on a few of those issues today, and things that are not externalities, because if you're looking at sustainability, particularly if you're looking at long-term prosperity, you can't do these things in a system that basically is set up to harbour monopolies. And, monopolies come from power imbalances, deliberately orchestrated power imbalances. And one of the biggest ones that's present in the life of every single person on the planet, rich or poor, is that power imbalance between men and women, males and females, but mostly just specifically men and women. So we'll, really focus on that side of things initially, I think.
And what was also really came out as prevalent to me it was Professor Bill who just spoke, was, I don't think you used the word, where is he? Is he still here? There's not a hand, he must not be in the room at the moment. He didn't use the word power, but when he was speaking about the mainstream way of looking at economics and the non-mainstream way of looking at economics, and the messages that we get from mainstream neoliberal governments, it's all based around power. If we're being told untruths about things, why are we being told untruths about things? It's power and control. And that really resonated to me when he was speaking. So.
And a lot of, there's always these assumptions when we begin these conversations, around things like work. So it is interesting to have a point of view close to the start of your conference from people who might have different cultural perspectives on these things and economic perspectives. So, for example, in neither of our languages and in no Aboriginal languages is there a word for work. Does that mean we're lazy? No. we don't have that word for work. The things that you do as, I don't know, I guess what you call labour now, traditionally in our cultures have been the things that everybody does in their spare time and on their holidays now. Bushwalking, camping, fishing.
Maybe a bit of time in the
craft
garden.
work,
yeah.
Spending time with the kids. Dancing, ceremony, all these things. So, we don't have a word for work at all. But anyway, I just wanted to tell you as part of my introduction, saying that I belong to the Upledge clan from Western Cape York, that I need to, that's lovely and everything, but then I also need to put that in a bit of a global context, which you might not be expecting. But particularly, if we're talking about global systems of finance and things like this, that was actually my clan's fault. We started, we didn't mean to, but 500 years ago we started the global financial system.
Oops.
And we did it by accident, all right? Because we had these visitors from the Netherlands 500 years ago. They came there to a place, it's near my homeland called Ngulmunk, but it's now, there's a little place there that's now called Kiawea, which, spoiler alert, is Dutch for turn back. Turn back. So anyway, you've got this kind of fledgling Ponzi scheme starting up there off the back of people who've come back from the Crusades, and they saw the Middle Eastern bazaars and marketplaces there, and they looked at the at the tokens that they were using. So they weren't just doing I'll give you a cartload of turnips for your pig. They were using these really interesting fungible tokens and stuff like that, and the people and the merchants and all the stakeholders were controlling their own currency and issuing their own currencies for the market itself. So they got excited, they brought back this system, and unfortunately that meant that the merchant class developed, which quickly was richer than the aristocracy, which the aristocracy did not like. So they came up with pretty much the incipient, like, prototype of the global financial system you see now. But 500 years ago, it wasn't quite all in place. There were a couple of pieces missing. So there was basically land-based capital as something that could be foreclosed on and seized if you weren't able to pay your debts. That didn't exist yet, because the rights to your land were inalienable under British and most European law, most of the Northern Hemisphere in those days, and inalienable here, like, oh, of course, Southern Hemisphere. And the other thing that was missing, I don't know, it was something important. Now I can't remember it. So anyway, some bloody thing. So there are a couple of things missing, yeah, but the main thing was that no land-based capital. The other thing was really important. I'm going to have to get back to it. So anyway, they sort of set up corporations. Yeah, corporations didn't exist yet. Okay, and that's really important because you can't build these Ponzi schemes without being able to shift accountability around and to, you know, invent what we will call gammon value out of something real and shift all that around. You need those corporations. Okay, so they came here with this in mind, and they had no fungible token of exchange that they could exchange in the Southern Hemisphere, which is way out of the sphere of trust that you need for the currency that they had. So their currency wasn't going to work here. And unfortunately, the main thing they brought to Upledge clan to trade was soap. Anyway, which I think they misunderstood the term fungible as something that lathers. Anyway, and then we misunderstood that commodity as well, because we looked at that and went, oh, that's fat. It was good fat, and we were eating it, and then there's bubbles coming out of the mouth and all this kind of stuff. And so, you know, that was good, but we didn't realize that we were beholden then, and that they had another idea of a commodity. We didn't understand that this was a commodity at this stage, because, as Kelly will explain in a minute, we had very different relations between the genders traditionally. Is much more egalitarian. The idea of women as chattel did not exist, but it did in Europe at the time. And so the Dutch people, they said, well, we gave you our soap, now we're going to take these women. And so they tried that, and
that didn't go down well.
She said, nah. So there were a few cracked heads, and then there were a few sharp words, and then there were a bunch of spears, and yeah, so they went home. Not many of them went home, because most of them got killed. They went home, and so basically the people who were backing the venture, they were very annoyed, and they couldn't actually recover their losses. So out of that trip came, they had to sit down and figure out how to make the system work to ensure these losses in the future, and make sure that didn't happen again. So they invented the world's first corporation. That began there. And out of the activities of the world's first corporation, they also invented another tricky thing, which was the land as capital. So capital being something that you could borrow against, capital that you could borrow against, and then you could take that money and invest it, and then insure those investments and bet on that, and then bet on the assurances of those, and bet on basically derivatives. You know how that algorithm, well, nobody knows how that algorithm works. Yeah, so anyway, I just have to deliver an apology. Sorry about that. That was our fault. We started the global financial system that we're all labouring under today. Yeah, so that's a nice little story, to introduce things.
And Tyson spoke about the gender differences in that, and how European, Western now, we would use that sort of language, view of women, and it's pretty similar now around what men and women can and can't do, should and shouldn't do, what girls and boys should and shouldn't do, and how we should and shouldn't behave. And that's very different to how it is understood in Indigenous culture. And of course in Australia there's 250 plus different communities in Australia, so it's different to every group in Australia in terms of relationality and how we interact with one another. But generally speaking, like Tyson said, it's more egalitarian, there's more equity in terms of shared responsibilities, and there's not the concept of weakness around gender, as in you're a woman, therefore you're less able or capable or physically able or capable to do. Everyone's in to make sure that we can get the best for the entire community. And that's very, very different to Western values. So that would have been a very, very quick misunderstanding that men and women... Now, in terms of equity and equality, it didn't mean that men and women did the same things. There would have been different roles and responsibilities, and that is where the sustainability comes in. But it's about that trust and reciprocity and sharing of responsibilities, and who owns those owns, that's not a great word, I don't like that word, but who takes care of those responsibilities, again, so that the whole community can thrive, which is fundamentally very, very different from European ways of doing things, which means that there would have been misunderstandings from the start. In Indigenous culture, everyone would have heard of men and women's business as a concept, conceptually. Some stuff we all know, some stuff men know, some stuff women know, some stuff old people know, and they don't know it until they're old people. Could be men or women. And that structure's set up on purpose. Some stuff everybody needs to know in terms of survival and responsibility. Women need to know certain things for women or for looking after community, just as men need to know certain things around community and men's stuff that women don't need to know, and vice versa, because it is about the sustainability of the community and how we all manage. And that's not about power, so that's not about me saying you can't know my stuff. It's more around just how do we make it work, and some things I just don't need to know, and I'm okay with that, which I also think is a fairly fundamentally different philosophy or way of seeing the world.
It's what it also ensured, having this really egalitarian society, is that there was distributed governance. The governance was distributed throughout the system, and everybody participated. Everybody had agency in this. Men and women had equal agency in governance until very recently in our history. You can't overestimate the importance of this, because it changes your paradigm. So our laws are things that are enacted through ceremony, and so if you've got women are holding half of those laws in their own secret ceremonies and men are holding the other half, it's kind of like it ensures balance, because we can't enact the right laws unless, those places are kept safe. Those places are kept safe through basically, different forms of agency. One of those forms of agency is violence, and that's something we're going to talk about a fair bit today. I know everybody sees violence as negative. All of us here growing up in this civilization right now, we're all trained to believe that violence is a negative thing. Violence is something that it's another monopoly.
Yeah, it's
a monopoly that's held by authorities and certain designated people who are sanctioned to use violence.
Or it's more of a anarchistic thing.
That's it. No. So, but in most global cultures, pre-industrialization, civilization, violence is something that's distributed, that everybody has access to, and it assures transparency. It also means that it doesn't happen very often, because everybody's walking around with the capacity to do violence. It's, you're not going to get away with anything for a start. So what we end up with is this really important balance that gives rise to a very important paradigm. Now, and this is what the Dutch came up against, this very different paradigm, and our introduction to the Dutch paradigm was quite startling. The one coming out of the Northern Hemisphere. What was coming out of the Northern Hemisphere was a growth-based economic system. So that was the paradigm. You know, the size of the economy needed to be continually growing. You know, and it needed to do that because of interest, of course. And I guess other people are going to talk about all those mechanisms and what eventually became reserve banking and all that kind of thing. But our economy it's just a slightly different word. And this is something that's controlled through, the laws for these are controlled in men's business and women's business through increased ceremonies. Have you ever heard of those referred to? We have increased ceremonies that are basically there to increase, in special increased centres and sites in the landscape. It's basically metaphors for how to make a system work and keep the system complex. So increase, I guess, is the difference. Okay, if you're going to apply it to this economy, it would be the difference between increasing the velocity of the dollar, and on the one side that would be increase, and then growth-based would be about increasing the amount of dollars that there are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you don't need to grow the size of the system, you just need to grow the amount of exchanges that are going on and the different pairs and threes and groups and things that are formed, and the different because there are so many different combinatorials that can happen just in a group of 1,000 things.
But that is about relationality and relationship, when the other is about acquisition. And then we bring into that power and control and wanting to, in terms of making the pile bigger, wider, deeper, taller, all of those sort of things. Whereas the sustainable one is not about those things. It's about increasing, like you said, the complexity of that.
So, I mean, I guess we argue that this economic system is an act of violence. So I talked about land-based capital earlier. This was an act of violence. It was invented, the law to be able to repossess someone's land if they default on a loan. It was invented as a trick to steal Indigenous lands in the Southern Hemisphere. That's what it was invented for. And when they worked it just perfectly, so they could go in and give you a couple of tomahawks and go, just put an X there on that bit of paper, and then they come back in a year and go, you owe us this much money, and then you're like, well, what's money? And then you go, well, you default on that loan, this land's ours. So it was a really extreme act of violence, and of course it was backed up by force, bailiffs, so there were genocides and executions and all these sorts of things to enforce that. So this economic system, it is an act of violence, and it's still enforced with the threat of violence today. Otherwise, why would any of you pay any of your debt? Any of your taxes in the first place to prop it up? It's that constant threat of violence.
And violence.
It is an act of violence.
And it doesn't
what
always
we're talking about is the Indigenous way of having that violence, that agency distributed throughout the system. Because it actually detonates any kind of violence in a lot safer ways, which we'll get into when we start talking about our research.
And also that the violence in the current system too is aimed at people individually. By a power. So a powerful body aims violence. And violence is not just, someone coming around slapping you around. That's, it's the consequences of it is placed at a person individually. And therefore you need to take responsibility individually for all of those things rather than collectively. And with the distribution within Indigenous community, it is about shared and collective responsibility. But however, there are consequences then if you do something that is against that. So if you break a rule or all of those sort of things, there are obviously consequences to that too.
Time to bring the stick out.
Time to bring the stick. My little warrior stick here. We've
collected our quantitative data on there for a project we're working on.
So all of the, this project is about violence that's stemmed from the writing that we did in Tyson's book. And so all of the data that we have collected has been marked on, which you won't all be able to see from here, but this has been marked on the stick. So this is all of our numbers here.
We chose that stick for a reason too. It carries a really strong message.
So it's a women's fighting stick. It's made out of gidgee, which is an acacia wood, which is apparently, you told me, this one of the strongest woods in the world. So, and I've been carrying it around all day feeling really powerful, and nobody has messed with me. So I'm quite liking carrying this stick around with me.
You probably haven't heard of a woman's fighting stick before. You would have heard of this under another name.
And it would have been called a digging stick. Yeah. So we're all in Indigenous cultures sort of sticks for various reasons. A boomerang is a stick. Clubs can be sticks. Women's fighting sticks, though, however, are the only implement that have been domesticated. I dig with it. I mean, it can be used for digging, for sure. I mean, it's a multi-purpose tool. It's like a Swiss Army knife, but Australian. It's, you know, it can do lots of things. But yeah, this is the only implement that's been domesticated to be called a digging stick. A boomerang is not called a men's digging stick.
Although we traditionally have used boomerangs for digging. So, but that's not called a men's digging stick. They're multi-purpose, and that is that, you know, that coming from a different way of seeing things. So, and it would be silly to think that men and women didn't engage in violence in certain situations as well. Like, why not use half of the population that happens to be there if you've got a conflict between, you know, one group and another, or those sort of things. So of course the entire community engaged. So would have children. So yeah, it's a very, very different way of seeing things. So a few years back, I don't know if you remember, there was a big media outrage about remote Indigenous communities, the fight videos on YouTube, and it was women. These women are fighting. This
massive
is disgusting.
Proportion of videos are
it really
women.
Did not fit the narrative of, you know, Indigenous women as victims, you know, in remote communities. People are watching these YouTube videos of women like boxing, you know, really competently and
with agency and with, you know, to resolve an issue, but in a controlled way. So not like, you know, a video of blokes out on the lash on a Friday night in an uncontrolled way, in a really, really controlled way, with other people engaged in that, watching, you know, commenting, those kind of things. And that really shocked the non-Indigenous community.
It really did.
Yeah.
But I was involved in a research project about that. I think mostly the idea was to condemn the violence. But after we actually looked at the data objectively, we could see that this was highly rule-governed, ritualised violence where there was, we couldn't find any instances where there was real physical harm being done. And we found emerging all these really strong rules that the crowds who were watching the fights were enforcing. So it was the entire community, elders, men, women, children, boys, girls, everybody were reinforcing the rules of this highly ritualised combat. And they were very strong rules, and they were always moving towards some kind of resolution, and they're really highly transparent. If anybody broke the rules, that you know, there was big problems. So there were particular things like there's no collateral damage allowed in these street fights. There's no, you know, dirty fighting, like hair pulling or hitting someone when they're on the ground, or king hitting. Kicking. You don't have any of these things. There's no kicking allowed, you know. The crowd will stop the fight immediately. So a lot of this outraged sort of violence, you know, like an outraged response to this. So that was that study that I was doing with non-Aboriginal people leading the study. And then Kelly and I got together and we wanted to flip it and go the other way. Yeah. So this one we've recorded the data for. We've actually done a bit of, I guess they call it reverse anthropology. We're looking at settler-on-settler violence in YouTube fight videos. Because there is a lot of street fight videos on YouTube.
Yeah, there really are.
Yeah. And so we only looked at the ones in settler states, because we found that in non-settler states, like places that weren't colonies, there wasn't the same kind of violence going on. It was
more rule governed.
Yeah, we actually found it was more rule governed. They were more working towards a resolution. There was very little chance of collateral damage.
People would step in if there was something that
no
was
harm.
wrong.
There was no, like, you know, getting someone on the ground and kicking them in the head 8 times or anything like that. But we found that in the settler community, the colonial settler states, there was a very different kind of violence going on. And we actually evaluated to see how many times they violated those Indigenous rules for ritualised violence.
And I don't know if you can see, but this
Lot
is
of
a light
violations,
coloured
yeah.
stick originally. It's got a lot and lots and lots and lots of little, and each one of these little marks represents a violation. So where people have maybe done, dirty things like kicking when someone's down, or even when they're unconscious, or doing really terrible things that people do when they have these terrible fights. We saw some really interesting things, and what also emerged from that was a really strong gendered theme. Men are allowed to engage in settler violence.
Public violence.
Public violence. They can go crazy and have it, and people will film it, and mates will, do all sorts of things and jump in and punch on and stuff. But if a woman really, truly gets that angry and wants to engage in violence, almost the entire, like a melee, will move away from a woman wanting to engage. And so the only role we were seeing that women could take in this kind of violence was as someone stepping in trying to break up a fight. And we've seen women walk in to fights in the tiniest little skirts and high heels, big massive bloke, tiny little woman, walk right into the middle of the fight almost without fear of being touched to try and separate a fight, and guys punching around her with not touching her.
Yep. The chivalry was
Unreal.
universal. Like, no matter what was happening, no matter how crazy they were, even if it was people trying to kill each other, even if they were pulling guns and knives or whatever, if they were desperately trying to kill each other, if that woman walked in there, it was really weird. There was this bubble around her. But there was also, and you think that's great because she's protected.
It's
but
benevolent sexism.
Because she had no agency also. Any woman who tried to actually join in the combat, men who were trying to kill each other would stop fighting immediately and join forces together to stop that woman from participating in the violence.
And if two women...
There were a few strategies they used for that.
And if two women... We saw one situation where two women engaged, and these women, obviously, I don't know if they'd done kickboxing or something, they were obviously equipped physically. This massive group of guys were fighting each other, and as soon as these two girls touched each other, the entire group of men united and sexualised the women that were fighting. It's a girl fight, a cat fight, all of those sort of things.
Yeah,
and they were like a brethren of united men all of a sudden, and these guys 2 seconds earlier had been wanting to kill each other.
That wasn't a one-off thing either.
No.
We saw that again and again, and we only saw this in the settler states. In other places that were either post-colonial or had never been settled, that they had their own sovereignty, these things didn't happen. So if you look at fight videos from Brazil, you'll see that the same as Indigenous communities, half of them are actually women fighting. But if you look from New Zealand, Canada,
and that's European,
the US,
New Zealand.
Taiwan was another settler state we looked at.
Israel.
We looked at quite a few. If you look at all those places, they all have the same brand of violence, which is very interesting, and it's violence based on a monopoly of violence.
Which then ties back into this initial discussion we had in Tyson's book around sustainability and that power and control and dominance and all of those sort of things. And it's not saying violence resolves issues or any of those sort of things, but it can. But it's around then who is allowed to engage in things, whom is allowed to do certain things, and that then translates into all sorts of things in community, and that is a way of groups controlling each other.
Power is violence.
It is.
The monetary system is power. So in any kind of system where you've got a monopoly, you need to look at that. You can't look at money without looking at violence, because it's the same thing. In fact, they talk about currencies being a fungible token of trust. I would say it's a fungible token of violence. It's a fungible threat token. That's the way I would see money from my point of view. But I guess that's the quantitative data from the study that we're working on.
So that's
We
our
haven't
number
written
story.
up
It was really nice to hear today's story being used in terms of economics. I don't know anything really about economics. It was really interesting, but to hear the word story being used was really nice. And so we often in Indigenous culture use the concepts of story, our narrative, and so that's our number story there. So yeah, our quantitative data is all recorded on that, the women's fighting stick. It's also recorded on a whiteboard and a bunch of other places too. But
So, and it is n equals 100, so it's not one of these gammon quantitative things
Yeah.
where they have a sample of 30 or something.
yeah, we watched
So,
over 100 fights
yeah.
really. So.
N equals 100. I don't know what n is though. Anyway, but this is our qualitative data, and yeah, I didn't want to put this on any of our native wood because there's
Fantastic,
swastikas and penises and stuff like that.
It's got some really amazing
This is
images.
so we did our stuff non-verbally, not non-verbally, but we didn't do it. We didn't record our data as print-based because we wanted to preserve the orality of our thinking and of our thoughts. So we used symbols. So we used this. We called the methodology picture story, and that's how we tracked all the qualitative stuff. And that's where the gender relations emerged from.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to put all those offensive things on any of our native woods, so I used English walnut to make this, Indigenous / Viking club. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's got all of the themes that we saw emerge from our 100 videos that we watched. And so, yeah, and there were very consistent themes that emerged around, how people engage in settler-owned settler violence.
Yeah.
It was super, super interesting.
And it was not, they just weren't the results we were expecting.
Not at all. And
we had to let go of a few
we
cherished
kept
hypotheses.
saying, we kept saying, oh gosh, this is challenging our preconceived, notions, what we might have thought would have happened.
Well, we were expecting to see no governance. But then that's where the gender thing came in, because what we were seeing was at most of the fights there were women who were trying to govern the fight, what was going on, instead of fighting themselves. Yeah.
Because that was the only role that they could take.
Yeah. So you could see they really wanted to...
Yeah, we saw some really angry women who really wanted to punch someone.
Yeah.
Nah, not allowed to.
They wanted to join in, but instead they had to... Don't touch him! Don't touch him! There was a lot of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It was very interesting. But yeah, it's so... thinking about rules-based and governed violence, and again, it's not about uncontrolled. It's absolutely the opposite of that. That is about coming to a resolution. All of the stuff that we did here, there was no resolution. It was violence for the sake of violence almost. And so therefore, how can that be sustainable?
You can't have sustainable prosperity. Upshot is when monopolies are in place, when power imbalances exist, and they're always violent. You cannot have sustainable prosperity. These are things you need to sort out, and it's all part of the one holistic picture. Just because your discipline might be economics, it doesn't mean you can call that an externality and ignore it. It's all part of the same system. This is an economic system that has been created to perpetuate these imbalances. And it's been created to make slaves out of half the world's population. It's been created to steal lands and basically destroy the entire world that we're on. That's what this monetary system's been created to do. This financial system particularly, which is different from the monetary system.
And like was discussed earlier, it's primarily based on lies.
Yeah.
So
you can't separate these things in black row economics from each other. They're part of each other.
I quite like that term.
We just made it up when we were sitting up there before. We're like, what do we do in micro or macro? I think probably black row.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's about it, actually.
Yeah, that's probably it, unless there's questions. Are we out of time, though?
We've got a little bit of time for questions, and I'd just like to thank again both Kelly and Tyson. That was absolutely wonderful. But I'm sure there'll be some questions people want to ask.
Thank you so much. It's definitely not what I expected from an economics conference. And I can feel my white privilege and my internalised misogyny just going nuts at the concept of grasping physical violence as something. So I've really got to look more into it. But what I wanted to ask does sort of tie back in with what Bill was talking about earlier. With the violence of, say, the intervention and systems that have been imposed on Indigenous people in terms of their financial sovereignty, etc., over the period of settlement, which is very nice of you to call it, I would have said invasion. Do you think that's the way that he was explaining the job guarantee? If there was funds there to pay for people for Indigenous people to fulfil their roles, there's been so much talk about fire stick, practices and that kind of thing. Do you see that there's a place in the job guarantee?
They have it.
They have it?
They've been trialling it for years.
Yep.
Yeah, it's called CDP.
Yeah, but we've got some really... That's really negative. But
I know.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This is the most important thing that every single one of you need to know. It's not just a case of getting social justice for us.
Yeah.
It's a case of everything that they have done to us, they are going to do to you.
Yeah.
And you just have to look at history. So foreclosing on land to pay debts, they did that to us first, and everybody was happy for that to happen. And then it went across to you.
Yeah.
Okay, welfare reform.
We've got the NG card.
Welfare reform, basics cards.
Yeah.
When they tried to get direct instruction into mainstream schools, all these sorts of things, everything they do to us is we're just the lab rats. They trial things on Indigenous people and then they get it across to you. When they suspend the Racial Discrimination Act to make sure a bridge gets to be put across, or build the Hindmarsh Bridge, when they suspend the Racial Discrimination Act to do the intervention, all these sorts of things, they're just running that past you to see if you'll accept it. Will you accept it if we just suspend laws for a while when we want to take away your human rights? Oh, they do accept it. All right, we've got a precedent for that now, and the time's coming really shortly, especially with the depletion of resources and the massive scarcities that are coming for you as this Greenland's on fire. From Greenland to Tasmania, everything's burning. All right? There are things coming for you. And there are precedents in law. Everything's been set up.
It's been done before.
It's all been set up and it's all been trialled on us. Everything that has happened to us, a lot of it is happened to you now as well. And a lot more is coming as well. So, if you want to look out for us, that's good. But you'll be looking out for everybody. That would be my message. Yeah. So the job guarantee thing, they've been trialling that for years in Indigenous communities too. I work for the dole scheme, basically. Yeah.
And my question that kept coming up in my head when that was being discussed, when you mentioned prior to 1971 and 100% employment, I kept thinking, I know there's a little percentage in there that, like 2% or whatever, and I kept thinking, well, that must have just been all of my family. Yeah, I just thought, because I don't think that would have ever in the 250-year history of Australia, ever applied to the Indigenous community. It's never had 100% employment. And so therefore, I kept thinking, what are those jobs? And then overlay of culture on that, like whom gets those jobs? And then, even that concept of hiring from the bottom, who's bottom? And how do you, where do they come from and what do you do? And how do you redistribute those resources, because you could be talking about people from remote communities and all of that sort of stuff. And it made my head hurt because I just kept thinking, how does that apply to my Aboriginal community? And as you can see, I'm pretty fair-skinned. I have European heritage too. But I think about my Aboriginal community and I just keep thinking, we're just going to get screwed again. Doesn't apply to us.
It's more a comment. Bill Mollison, founder of permaculture, said money is what you get when you destroy wealth. I feel that implies just what's happened, not just to Aboriginals, but for centuries and centuries of Indigenous cultures.
You've got to get your words right.
Yeah, and the concept of resources, and what that might mean to the Indigenous community versus other communities, like cultural resources and cultural knowledge and those kind of things, and the wealth of that.
Wealth, money, price, value. Basically, you're not going to be able to create a sustainable economy until you reimagine what value means, what value is. And for that, it's worth looking from a few different cultural perspectives, because we've had 500,000 years of human organisation collectively in this room, all of our ancestors. And, most of those were women too, I might add. Just genetically speaking, most of your ancestors were women, because until very recently until the industrial era pretty much, or until the Vikings maybe, I'm not sure, pretty much not very many men got to mate, because women were very selective, It's true, you read the genetic studies on it, there's not very many of your ancestors are males. There was a very small percentage of men who
had the babies.
gained the privilege of mating. So you're not looking at an anarchistic society. There are a lot of really sophisticated, governance and economic systems in your collective past, in our collective past as human beings, before these ridiculous, complicated, clunky models were put in place. It's probably worth revisiting some of them. Probably worth talking to a few people around the place who are trying things differently. Yeah.
Okay, I can understand your head spinning with the concept of a job guarantee, but I would, obviously a hunter-gatherer community belongs to history, and when we're talking about everybody being above poverty level, the job guarantee, how the job guarantee interacts with that idea that everybody, we've all got to be living above poverty level, participating, then you've got to look beyond you're teaching us about all that we can learn from the Indigenous culture, but I wouldn't want you to cut out that we're all moving forward into a new world where Aboriginal people will be walking on Mars and all this sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely.
So, yeah.
It's not about, I think, don't misunderstand in terms of when we're talking about that Indigenous stuff, that we're talking about stuff that is relegated to the past, and it's not, it's living, it's developing. And Tyson